Terrific. Stephanie, thank you so much for the introduction. Ellen, where did you go?
She's over here.
Oh, Ellen. Thank you so much for the invitation to come. It's been an absolute pleasure to visit Madison, and I have to tell you, I'm really excited to talk to all of you today. I was telling Ellen yesterday that I normally teach a public child welfare class for our 4E students at USC, and it's my favorite class because I get to connect with everyone who's actually out in the field doing the real work. But this year I'm only teaching research methods, so you guys will have to be my semester-long substitute for what I'm missing. So just so I have a sense of who's in the audience, how many MSW students are here? Okay, great. Doctoral students? Great. And folks from the community? Okay, perfect. So.
BSWs.
Oh, BSWs. I forgot you guys have a BSW program. Yeah, see, I had to do psychology when I was an undergrad because we didn't have a BSW program. So. Anyways, I'm going to be talking to you today about a few different things. I'm planning on kind of walking you through a few parts of my research, but I really do not want this to be a one-way conversation where I am talking at you, and I'm going to be covering a lot of stuff. So what I would absolutely love is if you guys do feel comfortable just either raising your hand or jumping in with questions at any point, because then I will know that I haven't put you to sleep, and hopefully you guys are getting something out of this. So I just want to, it's always important to acknowledge funders and collaborators. So the work that I'm going to be presenting is done in really, really close partnership with our state public child welfare agency in California, as well as our 58 county agencies. And I have to say that was one of the reasons that I actually chose to go back and get my Ph.D. at Berkeley, is I really liked the idea that I would be working with data and developing research in close partnership with those who were still in the field, because it was definitely not a clear, I definitely want to go back and just be on a research track. And if you'd asked me when I was an MSW student, I would have been like, no way. So that's really been very enjoyable. So Stephanie had mentioned the Children's Data Network. This is a new project, and the work I'll be sharing with you today emerges from this project. And our kind of vision is very, very simple, which is that we want to make better use of administrative data that we are already collecting about our children and families. And the way that we are going about doing that is we are partnering with different agencies, whether it's developmental services or child protection or healthcare services, to work with all of the data that their workers are collecting about clients, to link it together to better understand children's trajectories through systems. Now, sometimes when I talk to audiences, I will start to dive into what I find really interesting, which is probabilistic algorithms and all sorts of other things, and then what I will see is that iPhones and Blackberries pop out because I've lost everyone. So what I'm going to start today with is a very short 2-minute animation that we put together to help better explain in very simple terms what it is we are doing by linking records and what we believe it will achieve from a policy and program perspective in terms of really expanding the evidence base. I would also note that Wisconsin is like way ahead of the curve here, because you guys already have some great university agency collaborations. You guys are already linking data. In California, we are behind where you are. So this is very new. And so some of you may be familiar with this already, but let me show you my quick 2-minute animation here.
Children's experiences and environments between birth and age 5 are foundational to later good health, educational attainment, and overall well-being. At the Children's Data Network, we believe that by making better and smarter use of available data, we can ensure that more children grow up with the foundations needed for success. Throughout the life course, individuals generate data in the form of various records and documentation. When a child is born, health and demographic information is recorded. If that child is later referred for a developmental evaluation or receives early intervention services, other records are created. These records, called administrative data, are collected through distinct systems under the authority of different public agencies. The siloed nature of administrative data has long posed problems for policymakers, managers, and researchers. Information from a single agency provides a very partial picture of children's trajectories through systems over time. It cannot be used to determine the number of children concurrently served by 2 or more agencies. And it limits the identification of antecedent events captured in one data system that predict later outcomes observed in another. It is through a process called record linkage that information for the same individual can be integrated and used for research and evaluation. After records have been securely linked and anonymized to protect confidentiality, these data can be aggregated to generate rich epidemiologic information and answer important questions. Are nutritional supports during the first 5 years of life tied to later educational performance? Do children in foster care have unique health and mental health service trajectories? Does the receipt of early home visiting services lower a child's risk of abuse or neglect? Developing high-quality evidence for program and policy effectiveness is a strategy worth investing in for the long term. By making use of administrative records, the Children's Data Network can help us understand what makes our children, our families, and our communities healthier, safer, stronger.
Cute, right? Much better than me trying to explain that. But that's really what we've been doing. We've been trying to begin to link records so that we have them available for agency administrators, in-house researchers, academic researchers, others, to be able to use to answer questions about what types of services our vulnerable children are receiving, and to begin to make a better case for how some of those early supports may in fact translate into better outcomes, although those outcomes that you may observe may not be observable for 5 or 10 years and may actually show up in another system or another data source. So again, right now, here's where we are in California, lots of different data. Eventually, our public agencies will probably have data systems that speak to one another, so there won't be the need to do this linkage, but near term, we're doing this at the Children's Data Network, okay? Enough background information. So what have we done with some of these linked records? So this is my long list of topics I like to cover. I will not try to cover all of them today, but I am going to talk about 3 different areas where we have been using or supporting the public sector in its use of administrative records. The first is linkages we have done with vital death records so that we could better understand the risk profiles of children who have been reported to our child protection agencies compared with children who were never reported. We've also been using it to, I believe, generate what I think is some very relevant and actionable knowledge, so I'm going to talk about that. And then finally, I'm going to turn to a different use of administrative records, which is more the real-time use of historical administrative records to make better decisions about what types of services we are offering families. And for example, when a call comes into the hotline, decisions that are being made around whether we screen that call in for an investigation or we perhaps don't. So why is it that I want to talk about those 3 things? I want to talk about those 3 things because 1, I believe that the risk is very real. And it's important that each of us understand that regardless of whether we substantiate an allegation of abuse or neglect, the fact that a call is coming into the hotline does, on average, really tell us something about the vulnerability or the needs of that child and family. I'm interested in sharing with you the actionable knowledge because I think the example I will show you should leave you thinking, maybe it's not that everybody needs the same thing, and we should be comfortable figuring out where we focus our resources. And if we believe that we should be focusing our resources differently, then of course that takes you into, well, how do we use data to make some better decisions about how we're focusing those resources? Sound good? All right. So let's start with objective indicators of risk, or AKA the risk is real. So I'm going to present to you a little bit of data where, again, what we did is we linked up our state's birth records, our state's child protection records, and our state's death records. And we were interested in doing that because I was very inspired by this quote when I was actually a doctoral student. A mortality-based standard for evaluating parental behavior may be the closest we can get to culture-free definitions of neglect and abuse. So one of the challenges that we have, and I think I as a student struggled with, was this kind of overarching question as to whether it was that the case that children who were reported to our child protection system were truly at greater risk, or it was the case that they were simply coming from low-income families in very impoverished neighborhoods where they were bound to have more interactions with public agencies, and as a result, that surveillance system would be different, and potentially there would be more opportunities where they would get caught up in the net of the child protection system because someone would observe something and call it in. Okay, so that was kind of my question, and it's a very hard question to easily answer with just child protection data, because if you only have the child protection data, then who are you seeing? You're only seeing the kids who were reported. You don't have that comparison group. You don't have that broader population of children who may have also lived in those same neighborhoods or had those same risk factors present but were not reported. So what I did with this study, and this is my very, very simple picture of it, is we actually linked up 4.3 million birth records to over 500,000 child protection records and 25,000 death records. Now you have to remember, California is huge. So we have 500,000 children who are born in our state each year. Why did I need to assemble so many different records though? You have to remember, death is a very rare outcome, and on a relative basis, involvement with the child protection system is also a relatively rare outcome. So for me to be able to answer this question while also throwing in lots of other risk factors into my models, I had to have a huge population of children who I could follow. I also needed to be able to link back to birth records, because by following those 4.3 million children who were born in our state over time, what it allowed me to do was to effectively pick out children who looked like child A and children who looked like child B. So what do we notice about child A? You can imagine a child being born. We're following that child for 5 years. And what we're seeing is that at some point during those 5 years, a report comes into the hotline that they were potentially the victim of abuse or neglect. Meanwhile, we're following child B, who, as you'll see down there, looks very similar to child A, at least on the day they're born, so has the same risk factors present. We did a lot of matching around geography, et cetera. But we never see that child with a report to our child protection system. So that's the key difference, okay? And so we're following these 4.3 million kids. We are throwing into our models information about geography, about poverty, about whether a father was named on the birth record, whether the child was low birth weight, how old mom was, what mom's education was. So lots and lots of different information, where in prior work we had shown that a lot of that information we were throwing in was correlated with being reported to the child protection system, and other researchers had previously shown was also correlated with that outcome we were looking at, which was injury death. Okay? Now, one other thing I want to note, we chose to look at injury death before age 5 rather than just inflicted or maltreatment related injuries for a few different reasons. First of all, there is good research that would show that in the death record data we were working with, there's kind of an undercounting of maltreatment related fatalities, because we don't always do a great job of identifying and classifying deaths. There is no evidence that we miss whether the death was an injury or not. So we went with the broad category of injury deaths. And by looking at injury deaths, it also allowed us to not only look at those that were inflicted, which tend to be what the media and newspapers want to focus on and cover, but also the much larger category of deaths that are considered unintentional. So remember, if the bulk of our kids who are being reported to Child Protective Services are being reported for reasons of neglect rather than physical abuse, then it also stands to reason that perhaps they would be at risk for perhaps an unintentional injury death because a parent doesn't have a good understanding of what the appropriate level of parenting is given a child's particular developmental status, or perhaps there's a substance abuse problem that would then lead the parent to provide less than adequate supervision. So it's not going to necessarily be an inflicted injury, but it would be certain environmental exposures that would increase the likelihood that that child might, say, fall down the stairs or drowned in the bathtub. Okay, so that was the work. What did we find? We found that after adjusting for other risk factors at birth, so all of those kind of poverty and different demographic variables, a prior report to CPS emerged as the single strongest predictor of an injury death during a child's first 5 years of life. We also found that a prior report to CPS was very strongly associated with not just those inflicted injuries, but also with unintentional injuries. And very importantly, what we found is that there was really no difference in the risk of injury death based on whether we had screened that first report in and investigated, or we had gone out and investigated and determined it was unfounded. There was a slightly elevated risk if we had determined that the child was a substantiated victim of abuse or neglect, but even that was very modest. And we found that basically the risk came from the report itself. Now, of course, that's not causal. It's not that calling something in increases the risk, but my point is the fact that the hotline call came in was a signal that something was going on that truly did elevate the risk of this very objective complete absence of well-being that is a child death before age 5. Okay, I saw a hand. Yes, go for it.
So when you're looking at this analysis here, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about any factors that might have partially mediated the CPS call risk, and if there were any factors about families you wanted to observe that were not in your data set.
So great question. So let me show you the next 2 slides, and I'll talk about some of those covariates a little bit. Certainly, I will say that there were tons of things we wanted to observe in our data, and we couldn't. So the limitation of any administrative data set is that it's not really collected for research purposes. It's collected for case management purposes. Now, as you assemble more and more administrative data sets, what you end up with is a much richer set of variables that you can look at. But this is, let me just orient you to what we're looking at, and I'll talk about some of the other variables that we observed. So it's a little hard to see, but if you want to, you can just focus on what I've highlighted in red. So this is looking at the risk of any injury death, so inclusive of unintentional as well as intentional injury deaths. This is a child who had a prior report to Child Protective Services. They had a risk of injury death that was 2.6 times greater than a child who'd never been reported. And this yellow line represents a child who was never reported. That's how you can think of it. And then we looked at some other risk factors. We looked at being male, because we actually know that male children have much higher rates of injury fatalities than little girls do. So you can see that in this case, it would be male versus female. The yellow line represents that other group, female. We looked at whether or not a child had a health risk present. We defined that as being a low birth weight baby or having a birth abnormality. We looked at things like public insurance, the age of the mother, education, the absence of paternity. That was a really interesting variable. On birth records, we can see whether a father is named on the birth record. And you are only allowed to name a father on the birth record if he is there at the time of the birth and said, yes, this is my child. And what that also means is, yes, you can go after me for child support at some point down the road. Interestingly enough, though, in California, less than 9% of birth records don't have a father named. Among children who are involved with the child protection system, it's anywhere from 25 to 50% of kids who don't have a father named. So it's a big risk factor. Why might it be a risk factor? What do you guys think? Not having a father named on the birth record, why would that matter? I'll give you, oh, yes, great.
Well, you have a whole genetic half of that child that you have no medical history for, you have no data for the possible health risks of that child. And then in addition to that, it's stating flat out that this is a single parent household, so that increases the likelihood of these.
And I think the first point is a great one. I think the second point is probably the key one. So one, probably suggests something about maybe the material resources that might be available, financial resources to the mother if we don't have a second parent there. Two, it may suggest something about the social resources that are available to this mother if we don't have a second father or second parent there. But importantly, it also suggests that there is an increased likelihood that you will probably have unrelated male caregivers in the home with that child over the next few years, assuming that mom dates or gets remarried. And we do know that non-biological men being in the home is a risk factor for abuse and neglect. So with a lot of these data, we have to be really careful to not step beyond what we know. So all I can tell you is that showed up as a significant risk. Why it showed up as a significant risk is open to lots of different interpretations. So what I gave you there, I have no idea which, if any of those is accurate. There might be another list, but certainly that's one where in a lot of the research it's shown up as a very significant risk factor. We also looked at whether it was a firstborn child or not, and we also looked at race, ethnicity. Now there were a lot of variables we would have loved to look at. We were using whether the birth was covered by public health insurance as a proxy for income or poverty. We would have loved to have done a deeper dive into that. It wasn't available in our birth record data, and we needed to use information from the birth records so that we could have those data for the 4.3 million children we were following. Okay? In terms of unintentional injury deaths, you can look at this chart the exact same way, but here we're only looking at unintentional injury deaths. So we see that a prior report to CPS was associated with a risk that was twice that of other sociodemographically similar children who hadn't been reported. And finally, if we look at intentional injury death, this is where we see the largest difference. We see that children with a prior report to CPS had a rate of intentional injury death that was 6 times that of children who had never been reported. And again, these findings really did not change much at all if I limited it only to kids who were screened in, screened out, substantiated. There was a slight movement, but there were very, very few differences. It was really the fact that a report had come in that seemed to signal something about this child's risk of death. Now, this is what we've got. Now, I want to point out something really important. We were looking at 500,000 kids who had a report to CPS. Fewer than 1% of those kids died. So it's really important to remember that on an absolute basis, a very, very small number of children do sustain fatal injuries. So what we're seeing is, yes, kids who've been reported definitely are at higher risk of this most severe outcome than children who haven't. But again, I always want to caution people that we probably should not be designing an entire system of services around trying to prevent a handful of deaths, but the deaths themselves are very useful for saying, you know what, our surveillance system probably is picking up kids who truly are at greater risk on average than kids who are not getting reported, okay? We looked at another thing with this because, of course, we do tend to focus on inflicted injury deaths in the context of child welfare involved populations, but actually more children die of sleep-related deaths here in the United States each year than die of maltreatment-related fatalities. So in the US, there are about 4,500 children who die during the first 12 months of life, and we generally call these sudden unexpected infant deaths, which means that it's not because of some congenital abnormality. The child was not being seen for medical concerns that contributed to the death. The child just died. And right now, those sudden unexpected infant deaths fall into 3 broad categories. We have SIDS deaths, which you guys have all probably heard of. We have something I had never heard of before, ASSB, which stands for accidental suffocation or strangulation in bed. And then we also have sudden unexpected infant deaths that are called undetermined or classified as undetermined. Now, why did we look at those 3 death types? We looked at those 3 death types because, interestingly enough, we have and I don't want to get into a huge debate because maybe I'm wrong about this, but we generally, from a public health standpoint, hail the Back to Sleep campaign as being a hugely, hugely successful public health campaign which significantly reduced the number of babies dying from SIDS. I think there is definitely some truth to that, but as I want to show you here, if we look over time, we've seen there's been a very, very modest decline in the post-neonatal death rate. What is the post-neonatal death rate? Those are deaths occurring after 28 days of life. Okay? What we see is if you only looked at the SIDS rate, you'd be like, oh my gosh, this is totally awesome. We initiated this Back to Sleep campaign, we made some other changes, and we've seen this death rate drop. But what happened is right around the same time that we initiated this broad public health campaign, we also made some changes as to what was required to be able to classify a death as being due to SIDS. So at the same time that SIDS was declining, we were seeing a statistically significant uptick in the number of undetermined deaths and a statistically significant uptick in the number of deaths that were classified as suffocation or strangulation in bed. So what is that called? It can be called kind of a diagnostic shift in how we're classifying deaths. So again, we perhaps should be somewhat more cautious in thinking that this was such a successful campaign. But that was not the point of this research. The point of this research was, as much as we think that maybe there's been a shift, then what we really want to do is we probably want to look at all three categories or groups where we might see deaths showing up. So what we did is we kind of did the exact same thing where we were following those 4.3 million children. We were only looking at deaths during the first year of life, and we were looking at whether being reported to CPS was significantly associated with risk of one of these sudden unexpected infant deaths. And I haven't shown the covariates here, but if we're looking at this, these are all adjusted. And what we're seeing up here, this is an overall SUID. So an infant who's been previously reported to Child Protective Services died of a sleep-related death at 3.5 times the rate of a little baby who'd never been reported. We can then see them broken out for the types. So we see SIDS, undetermined, and the accidental suffocation or strangulation in bed. So again, in terms of thinking about this as a very, very vulnerable population, a population where, again, this includes all reports, regardless of whether it was substantiated. We looked at differences, not much emerged. We can see that it's not just intentional or inflicted injuries, it's also sleep-related injuries, which may have important implications for how we coordinate services and partner with healthcare fields, public health nurses, et cetera. Finally, we did one other thing. Remember how I was talking about the fact that unintentional injuries might be related to neglect allegations and that most of our young children are reported for reasons of neglect? So one of the other things we did is we actually looked at that. We looked only at the kids who'd been reported to Child Protective Services. So now we're kind of ignoring the other 4 million or so. We're just looking at kids who've been reported. And what we did is we looked at what type of allegation type they had. Had they been reported for some, in California it would be other allegation type, which might be emotional abuse, substantial, there are a few different categories there. Were they reported for neglect, or were they reported for physical abuse? And what we found was really interesting. If you look at this first column, this is looking at all injury deaths, and what we find is that children who've ever been reported for physical abuse have a risk of injury death that is 70% higher than children who've only ever been reported for neglect. Okay? If it was a child where they were reported for neglect and then had a second report where they were reported for physical abuse, we were running what are called survival or kind of time models where we were counting them as being at risk of death as a kid in our neglect group for the period in which the neglect allegation was kind of the top one. And then the minute the physical abuse allegation came on, we switched them, and then they were being followed as a kid who was known to the system because of the physical abuse allegation. So we see that physical abuse higher than neglect, but when we then break it out and we look at intentional versus unintentional injury deaths, we see something very interesting. We see that actually most of the risk is really concentrated in the intentional injury death. So if you're one of the kids who's been reported for physical abuse, your risk of an intentional or inflicted injury death is 5 times that of another child who's also been reported, but only for reasons of neglect. But if we instead look at unintentional injury death as our outcome, we see that children who've been reported for physical abuse have a significantly lower risk of dying from an unintentional injury death. So what we start to see is actually there does appear to be a relationship between the type of allegation and the risk of different types of injury death. Now, so what do you do with this from a practice or a policy standpoint? And this is where often there is no simple one answer with data. So one thing you might do is you might look at all injury deaths and say, if my goal is to simply reduce the risk of injury deaths, knowing that children who are reported for physical abuse are a very small subset of kids who are reported, maybe I would focus some efforts there. I'm probably going to be able to prevent more intentional injury deaths. If, let's say, I have a flag in my system, so every time a child's reported for physical abuse, maybe I send out 2 workers, or maybe the supervisor is going to do a little bit more intensive kind of review and work with that caseworker to make sure nothing kind of slips through the cracks and that we're really helping that family. But unintentional injury deaths are the much larger group of deaths. So if our goal is simply to try to reduce the number of deaths occurring, then maybe we don't take that approach with the physical abuse category and we actually start focusing on, well, how do we really come into these families and make sure that some of the other public health messaging around the safety of the environment and the proper parental supervision and child development that might be contributing to this heightened risk of unintentional injury death is addressed. So again, there's not really any one answer, but the data has been provocative and has sparked a lot of discussions in California as to how we should be addressing that, because while these deaths are, again, small in number, they still reflect perhaps other dynamics and other situations in the home that we would want to address. Okay? Any questions about any of the death stuff that I just happily threw at you on a Friday morning? Yes?
So I'm curious about what you controlled for. So did you have zip code level SES, or what were some of the controls?
So we used county fixed effects. We didn't go down to pull in any kind of census tract or any other data, because since we had the child level data, we figured that the public versus private health insurance, some of the direct measures of maternal education were going to be robust enough. We did do some work to look at how much variability, because we could embed some of those individuals within their census tract. And what you find is that any level of aggregation, whether it's a block group or a census group, the overall rates you might see for SES status are a good proxy for what the characteristics of the individuals in that geography are, but because we had the individual level data, it didn't actually add anything to include that superimposed kind of geography level there.
So, but you wouldn't know, for example, so a hypothesis could be that if you live in a certain area where there's a lot of surveillance, that's why there's higher rates of reporting, so you weren't able to control for that.
We did not control for
other
that.
than county, which is...
Yeah. I mean, we in California have a county administered system, just like you guys do here. And listen, I think that with a lot of these studies, it's one of those things where I'm like, yeah, we're just beginning to scratch the surface. So we were trying to kind of answer a very, very broad question across the board. What do we think is the connection between a report to CPS and injury death? But it might be more nuanced than that. The fact that there could be a lot of noise in terms of surveillance is something that I think needs to be considered.
Can I throw
Yes,
in there?
yes.
So how cool, 2 aspects of this. So first, that there's no difference between reported and substantiated. That's huge, right? But it has scary implications, because then how do you interpret that moving forward? Because moving forward, if you change how things are reported, that's not, the way people are naturally reporting now is related in the same way of substantiation. But moving forward, if we encourage people to report more, it's no longer going to be true.
No, it's
Right?
a very,
So it's tricky. It's not, like you said, it's not causal. It's not the reporting that is leading to the death. It's the fact that people saw something so bad that they reported. And if people start seeing something less and being encouraged to report, it's not necessarily.
No, you're exactly right. And it may be, again, let's say that we completely change what the threshold is for reporting. We would have a much larger number of kids coming in. We might not see as strong a relationship because then we have all these kids who weren't at risk who are being pulled into the system. I think that we have to be really careful also to, how much can this be generalized? A report in California may have a different threshold and mean something different in terms of child risk than a report elsewhere. And again, that was something that we were aware of. Even in a given county, there's going to be the variability there. I will say that I found out last week that Washington State has pulled together all of their birth, child protection, and death record data to replicate these analyses exactly, because they were very curious as to whether the same dynamics could be observed in their state, even though they have a very different system of reporting, substantiating, providing services in the home. And I've only gotten a preview, but they were like, it's kind of crazy because we're coming up with very, very similar findings despite some key differences. So I'm actually going to Seattle next week to sit down with them and look at their data. But yes, I mean, these may be very specific findings to California, and Stephanie's exactly right. If that threshold changes, then a report to CPS could mean more, or it could mean less, right? I mean, so we did. It's also important to keep in mind that these are just children 0 to 5. And that was intentional both because with injury death rates, it was the one kind of period of life where I felt fairly comfortable that most of the deaths that were going to be occurring were occurring in the home, or at least under the supervision of another caregiver, as opposed to, say, if we'd looked through age 16 where you're going to get more traffic. I mean, there are a bunch of different things there. So I also think that we end up with less of a variability around what gets reported with very young children than you do once you start to increase in age, where different policies around whether school absences contribute to an educational neglect report, et cetera. So, okay. Yes?
I was wondering, did you look at all at for cause of death? Because I'm assuming you would do like coroner reports. And kind of for this age group that you looked at, the rate of unknown causes of death and what that means?
That's a great question. We did look at it. I don't remember off the top of my head, other than that I remember for babies, it was kind of the blunt force trauma, which is tied to kind of shaken baby. And with the unintentional injury deaths, you saw a lot of falls and drownings. With the inflicted injury, I don't quite remember, and I also don't remember how many unknowns there were, but you actually reminded me that that's something else we wanted to go back in and look more closely at. And of course we have to be careful because then you get down into very small numbers, but again, it could still be very interesting to see how many aren't having kind of what's called a mechanism or manner of death coded there. So I think I saw another hand. Yes? No? Okay. All right, so that's death. And moving on to something else that's nice. So here's why I think we need more than just a kind of a kitchen sink of one-size-fits-all services. So another thing that we were able to do with some of these linked records was to link just the birth and child protection records, but to answer a different series of questions. So what we heard from a lot of our agency partners is there was a lot of interest in, well, how many young women in our foster care system are parenting? And what happens to those kids? And again, we didn't have great data for that because the consensus was that yes, caseworkers are paying attention to this, but it's often getting recorded in those unstructured case record notes as opposed to some of the structured fields where it would be easy for our agency partners to pull in the data, analyze it, and provide some statistics. The other challenge is, of course, let's imagine you have a 16-year-old girl who enters foster care. It may be that she gave birth at age 15. Perhaps the baby is with her aunt, so we're not necessarily going to see the birth occurring while she's in foster care, and therefore we might not have a good record of it. So what we did is we linked around, I think it was 1.5 million birth records concerning teen births in California going back a decade, and we developed a bunch of different analyses. We looked at, for example, how many teen mothers, when we look at those teen moms, and then we look back to see if they had any child welfare involvement prior to getting pregnant, how many were previously known to the system. Any guesses as to what that number is? It is really big, or at least I think it's really big. So it was 45%. So this is in the population overall. All teen moms in California, when we look back, we saw 45% had a prior report to CPS, 20% had officially been substantiated as victims, and around 10% had spent some time in foster care. And those are what researchers like to call conservative estimates, because we could actually only go back to 1998, which meant for the bulk of our teen moms, we are missing the first few years of life when you tend to have higher rates of child welfare involvement. So those are very conservative estimates. We also cut the data so that we could look at how many young women each year were giving birth while in the foster care system, and what characteristics of their placement, time in care, et cetera, were correlated with higher or lower rates of giving birth. We then did some work where we looked at kind of a longitudinal picture of not how many girls give birth in any year, but by age 18, how many girls who are in our foster care system and were there at age 17 are parenting at least one child, how many are parenting by age 19, 20, and actually now 21. And that's increasingly relevant because California has recently extended foster care for non-minor dependents, or youth who are in foster care at age 17 and may not have exited to permanency. They can now opt in to extended foster care, not just through 19, 20, but actually through 21. And what's interesting about that is we're seeing that around 70% of youth are choosing to remain in care, so it's a huge number. And the data that we have would suggest that a full 1 out of every 3 of those girls will have given birth at least once by age 21, whereas by age 18 it was only 1 in 10. So historically the system has not, again, 1 in 10 is not necessarily a small number, it's still 10% of these young women having given birth at least once by age 18, but it's a big jump to say 1 in 3, and so it's really sparked some discussions around, well, what types of services should we be providing for non-minor dependents? We talk a lot about housing and let's get them to college and all these other great things, but if we haven't thought about childcare and what other supports may be needed for these young women as mothers, we're not going to necessarily be opening the doors for those other things. Yeah?
Since only some kids choose to continue in the foster care system, could they be choosing it partly because they got pregnant?
So that's a great question, and we don't have good data for that yet. So these are based on, these are older data before we had that policy in place. And because we could follow these girls who were in foster care through the birth records, we could see how many had given birth. Now, it's entirely possible that girls who've given birth are more likely to stay in than your average teen in foster care. It could be that they're less likely to stay in. It could also be that that 35% number drops dramatically because 2/3 of the births we see occur after age 18. It could be that that was because of the instability that was created when these youth were historically aging out of the system. And the simple fact that we are providing 3 more years of support may lead to declined birth rates. So,
That makes sense.
yeah.
I thought the data came from only the ones who were in the
No.
system.
So yeah, so this is all historical data, but the reason it was relevant is that because we had this in real time policy change taking place, people wanted to know, what does some of the historical data say about what we might see as the shift? And it's also great because when you have that baseline data, what we can now start to do is assess whether this policy change has been protective. And we still have this data coming from outside of the child protection system where we can look at this outcome across the board, regardless of whether the young woman is staying in care or not. Okay, so that's some of the work that we did with the data, but the study I'm going to talk with you about today is actually one where we also looked at a really interesting, some interesting questions around intergenerational child protective service involvement. And that's a topic where we haven't actually had much great data because a lot of the research has been of the following nature. We see a child who's been abused or neglected. We interview mom and we say, were you also the victim of abuse or neglect? And she says, yes, I was. And then we develop estimates based on that. But of course, again, it's retrospective, and who we're missing would be all of the moms who may themselves have been victims of abuse or neglect, but where their kids don't end up in the CPS system. So one of the things I really like about working with administrative data is that we can use this retrospective data. It's already been collected, it's a little bit old, but we can answer prospective questions if we're creative in how we assemble the records to look at some of these dynamics. So in this case, what we did is we looked at all teen moms who gave birth in 2006 and 2007. Now, maybe that feels like a weird year, but for us it was kind of the sweet spot in our data because we wanted to link with child protection records in 2 different ways and for 2 different individuals. We took all these teen moms and we linked them to historical child protection records going back to their 10th birthday. Now, we wish we could have gone back further, but we wanted to have kind of a common endpoint, and because we had a change in data systems, we weren't sure about the quality of the data before that point. So we said, listen, we're going to go back to age 10 because we can do that for each of our teen moms. And we looked at, was the mom ever reported, and was the mom ever substantiated? Then what we did is we took all the babies who were born to these teen moms, and we did a separate linkage. We linked them prospectively to their 5th birthday to say how many of these babies were ever reported and how many of these babies were ever substantiated. So we used those 2 different thresholds. So I was telling folks yesterday that I love talking about different statistical models and whatever else, but I also really love it when I have a project where you actually don't need to look at any covariates and you don't need to look at any fancy coefficients because the story is so strong, it emerges just in a descriptive chart. And I will also tell you that a very senior scholar who I have a tremendous amount of respect for once told me, if I can't see it in a 3x3 table, it's probably so far removed from practice and policy that it's of no use. So this is one of those examples. So let me just tell you what I'm going to be showing you. We actually have 2 charts here. We have children reported by age 5 on the left-hand side. So that's any report, could have been screened in, screened out, but it was not substantiated. And there could have been 5 reports, but none of those 5 reports were ever substantiated. And we're just looking at unique children. Over here, we have substantiated by age 5. And what we're doing is we're going to follow every baby who was born in 2006 and 2007 to a teen mom for 5 years. So that's what we're seeing on the x-axis, birth to age 5. And we're going to look at cumulatively, whew, that's a mouthful, how many were ever reported and how many were ever substantiated. And we're going to look at those babies based on their mom's history. So we're going to look at children born to teen moms where when we searched the records, we didn't find any indication mom had ever been reported. We're going to look at children born to teen moms where mom was reported at least once, but she never had any substantiated reports. And then we're going to look at children born to teen moms where mom herself was a substantiated victim. Okay? So here's our first line. Okay, this gray line, what we see is that by age 5, around 18% of babies born to teen moms where mom has no child welfare history have been reported to Child Protective Services. And we see that about 5% of those babies have been substantiated as victims, okay? Those are children born to teen moms where mom has at least one report and it wasn't substantiated, but now we're talking about 35% of the babies having at least one report and 12% substantiated. And this is our final group. Substantiated report, we see it's almost 45% of the babies reported, and we see 18% of the babies substantiated. Now I have to tell you that this really did surprise me for a few different reasons. One, we're looking at what is already a pretty high-risk subpopulation of children born to teen moms, okay? So you don't necessarily expect that you're going to find one variable that so differentiates risk. Now, many of you might be sitting there saying, yeah, but there's got to be a lot of surveillance bias. We're probably just picking up that if mom was involved in the child welfare system, even if technically it doesn't mean her baby needs to become a ward of the state, you've got all these extra social workers or caseworkers paying attention, or maybe they feel the need to bring the baby in so they can get into a foster home together or whatever else. We were very aware of that. So what we did is we were exceptionally conservative. We excluded 1,200 teen moms who had any CPS involvement after they got pregnant. So we excluded from this analysis everybody who was in foster care after getting pregnant, or may have just had a report coming in, not about the kid, but about the mother herself after getting pregnant. We've actually pulled them aside and we're doing a kind of a different analysis with them because we recognize that there could be surveillance, so we wanted to understand who was the reporter, what was going on. But for this analysis, they don't show up. So on the one hand, I think that these are very, very depressing statistics. On the other hand, what is exciting is that if you look at the orange and red line here and the orange and red line there, if we were successful at bringing the rates of next generation child welfare involvement down to this level, which is your average teen mom who doesn't have any history, we would actually move the needle in terms of a significant decline in reported and substantiated maltreatment within our system overall, because teen moms are a large enough population with child welfare involvement, and we see that, again, a huge bulk of that concentrated risk actually isn't really about being a teen mom, it's about being a teen mom with the vulnerability that is a history of child welfare involvement. Now, a few other things. This gray line here, 18% and 5%, another thing that's really interesting is it's not shown on this chart, but we computed these same statistics for moms who were not teen mothers. Now, if you weren't a teen mom, we didn't have the child welfare history, because remember I told you we didn't have complete data, but we could just say, listen, mom who's not a teen mom, how many of their babies get reported by age 5 and substantiated by age 5? And the numbers are very, very close. So again, it speaks to the fact that it's not really, in this case, being a teen mom per se, it's being a teen mom with whatever is reflected by the trauma or the instability of this history. Another thing that's important to keep in mind is that we don't know for sure that mom was the perpetrator here, okay? So when I have spoken with youth who are parenting and doing very, very well, almost always they can point to an aunt or a grandma or a family friend, someone who was able to step in and help them, including helping them with childcare and some of the burden that is placed when you have often a young single mother or parent. And so what we may be picking up here is simply, if you think that these girls are not in foster care at the time that they give birth, but we know they've had some recent child welfare involvement, which may suggest some recent instability in the family kind of network, then these may be mothers who are particularly vulnerable in terms of having safe extended family members that they can turn to for childcare help. And so maybe, I mean, I've heard anecdotally that, you know, again, it's not necessarily that mom was the perpetrator. It could have been that mom made what amounted to a bad call in terms of who she left her child with. But I do just want to point that out. It's something we'll try to look at. I don't know that the administrative data will be great for it. Sometimes you got to use the administrative data and then figure out more qualitative or mixed methods for diving into some of the case notes or interviewing people. But this is something where I wanted to point this out because when I talk about prediction models and predictive risk models, I think a part of it is if we have a limited set of resources, how do we target those most effectively? And I think these data really speak to that if we only have 100 home visiting slots in our community, we could either say, you know what, we're just gonna throw them at whatever teen mom happens to have given birth and maybe wants services, or we can say, you know what, we have data that would suggest that the risk is not the same for all teen moms. And if we have enough service slots to serve everybody, great. But if we only have 100, maybe we should try to figure out who gets the right of first refusal for a particular intensive service. Okay? Any questions about this? Yeah.
And just to clarify, for maternal maltreatment, that includes all types of abuse and neglect, like it wasn't.
In terms of the history that the mom had?
Yeah, or even for the reports of maternal maltreatment of the
Yep.
child.
We included everything, neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse. Now for the babies, it was predominantly neglect because they were young. And I don't even want to say babies, but through age 5, although you do see physical abuse. What was interesting is for the moms, a lot of times there really was very chronic involvement. So, you know, when we looked through and we said what was the prevalence of any past reported physical abuse or sexual abuse or neglect, you saw a lot more physical abuse and sexual abuse popping up than we think of when we just look at a single point in time. Okay. Yeah.
My question is also about maltreatment type. Is that do the solid line and the dashed lines have a similar distribution of maltreatment types, and does maltreatment type determine subsequent generation maltreatment?
That's a great question. I don't remember if we looked at that, and I think we should. So it's a great question, and I think that if I remember, I think we saw that neglect was the overwhelming, but I don't know if we looked more closely at setting aside the big neglect bucket, were there differences? The other thing I will say is that we did also control for whether mom had just one report or kind of we counted the number of reports, and that was also positively tied to, I mean, we did run lots of statistical models, and it was positively tied to the likelihood that her child was involved. So it's a great question. Any other questions about this? Yeah, go for it.
So I was wondering seeing these are teen moms on both sides. So did you have any data, because sometimes you get like report source. So are people, like, is the service provider for the mother or for the child who are calling that report in? Does that question make sense?
Is the reporter, can you say that last part again?
So is the reporter coming into contact with the family because they're a service provider of some kind to the mom or to the child victim?
Yeah, it's something that, again, for the group of mothers who were in foster care when they gave birth or had child welfare involvement after getting pregnant, we are doing a deeper dive both in terms of what is classified as the reporter type, but also we're hoping to be able to go into the case record notes and kind of better understand the relationships. Here, we're kind of stuck with some pretty crude levels of reporter type, so we can see, was it a medical provider, was it a social service provider, but we also have this very large bucket of other, where we can see it was a mandated reporter, but we don't have additional details, so we've kind of been stuck with mandated or not, but it's a great question, but again, the administrative data will only take us so far, unfortunately, at least in California. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about predictive analytics, and also called decision aids, preventive analytics, preventative analytics. I don't think we've really figured out exactly what we're calling it, but this has kind of been a bit of an emerging hot topic in the field of child welfare, because I think, it's always, it shouldn't always be about child deaths, but often what happens is when a child does die or there's some severe injury, we'll look back at their child welfare history and we'll say, oh my God, this kid was reported 7 times, the police were out 3 weeks ago, we had 2 other kids who spent time in foster care. Like, how did we miss this, right? And of course, it's that classic, it's always so easy to look back and say, how did we miss this? But I think that, again, there's been this increasing awareness that one of the reasons we do miss things is that we haven't put all of the pieces of that puzzle together in terms of the child's risk. And that's for a few different reasons. One, we haven't always had, and we still don't always have, the data that are needed. So when we get to that, fully interoperable systems, how amazing will it be to say, I'm looking at a report that just came in concerning an allegation of abuse or neglect, neglect. It doesn't seem all that serious, but oh my gosh, the police have been out to that house 3 times in the last week because of DV calls, right? So, this is not something I'm going to screen out. Workers don't always have that information at their hands. The other reason that I think we don't always put the puzzles together is that we all love, myself included, to think that we're really good at weighting lots of complex risk factors and predicting future outcomes. We're really not that good at it. And no field is that good at it, as I will show you. But so I think that there's been this awareness that, maybe we should revisit some of the tools we've been using, particularly very upstream when we're making a decision about lots and lots of kids who are, say, reported to the hotline, where at that point we really don't have a lot of good clinical information, but we're still making a really, really important decision. Do we screen in or do we screen out? So renewed interest in this because we have a lot more data than we've ever had before. And by the way, that will be one of the challenges your generation faces, which is how do you make use of overwhelming amounts of data and filter through all the noise to get to the important parts of it. We have lots of advances in technology where you don't have to just do what I'm doing, which is looking backwards or looking forwards with backwards data, but you can actually start to harvest information and use it in real time. As I mentioned, there's a growing appreciation that we have scarce time and resources, and we're not as great at weighting complex factors as we would like. And there's also, I think, this increasing awareness that as much as we would like, services and resources are always going to be less than we would like in terms of their availability. And so, again, how do we improve performance by focusing in on those where we most need to provide the services to improve outcomes or performance. So let me just give you a few examples. One, we have fraud detection. So Visa, for example, has a program where when you put your credit card in, what it's doing is it's harvesting information from lots of different data sets, real-time information about whether there's been a breach, so that if there's been a breach and your information was captured in that data set, they're going to kind of score you a little bit higher. I was joking with Ellen yesterday that when I checked into my hotel in Madison, they're like, yeah, sorry, your credit card's declined. And I'm like, okay. I called up the credit card company. They're like, oh, sorry, we put a hold on that because we saw that you were taking an Uber in San Francisco and now you're in Madison, and that seems a little weird. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm here, right? So it doesn't always get it right, but it's using little things like that to trigger this might be a fraudulent transaction, and this can happen in a millisecond. And again, it's not always going to get it right, but it's going to try to flag those transactions that might be fraudulent. Another example, and I find this one to be funny because I'm a professor, so universities have started trying to use some of the data that is generated or created when you are perhaps signing into Blackboard, or I'm teaching a class that's online where my students are asked to interact with a lot of readings and videos. And so information is generated to see which students in the class are clicking on these different materials, how much time they're spending in kind of classroom chats with other students, how much time they're spending interacting with that material. And so there have been some algorithms developed to help identify students who might not be doing well in the class, or where past data would suggest that their interaction with the materials reflects a pattern where students who've had that similar pattern have perhaps failed the class. Now, I like this example because it goes to show that predictive risk modeling is only one part. Do you have the technology and the algorithms? But it's another human part about what do you do with that and how do you translate it. So this was an example where their first iteration of using this involved sending an automatic email to the student being like, you are at risk of failing this class based on a model we've developed. which apparently, one, students were having heart attacks, as you guys can imagine. Two, it had the unintended consequence of a lot of students being like, oh my God, we need to withdraw from this class as opposed to getting extra help. So they're like, okay, wait, this is not a good approach. And they've since modified it. So what happens is an email will go to the professor so that the professor can touch base with the student and talk with them. Or maybe the professor says, oh, this score is a joke because I happen to know that this student emailed me in advance, told me she was downloading all of the materials back in July because she was so excited about reading them, and so she's like my top student. But so an example of how you can use data, but it's the translation that is going to be so key as to whether it actually has an impact. Now, moving into kind of public sectors and the use of administrative data for predictive risk modeling there, one of the places where it's most advanced would be in healthcare settings. And this is a study developed by a colleague from New Zealand, where one of the things that they discovered was hospitals were very interested in reducing the number of patients who were discharged and then readmitted within a year. Okay? Not good for the patient because it means that something went wrong with potentially the coordination of their care, and also can be quite costly for the hospitals because some of the ways that billing is set up is such that you're kind of on the hook for any of those readmissions that occur. So one of the interesting things they did is they actually went out and they talked to doctors and they collected data, and they would say to the doctors, okay, so you are discharging these 10 patients over the next week. Who is the most likely to be readmitted? Oh, and how confident are you that you're right about that? And so the doctors said who they thought was going to be readmitted, and were like super confident because doctors don't have egos or anything, right? So, and apparently the doctor's ability to predict which of their patients was going to be readmitted, boom, no better than flipping a coin, okay? But it was helpful to have that data because we as clinicians don't always like to have tools handed to us where we feel like it takes away some of our clinical judgment, but there are some things where it's just really hard to predict because it's all these little pieces of data that need to be assembled to really assess what the risk is. So what they did is they developed a model that harvested information from the medical records of patients who were being discharged. They generated a risk score that indicated whether it was a patient who was very likely to be readmitted or not. And then what they did is they sent an email to the primary care physician of the patients who were higher risk for being readmitted, saying, Jane Doe has been discharged recently. Here, she appears to be in an elevated risk. It would be great if you could reach out. Here are some best care practices. In addition, they found that there were a group of patients where they were really, really high risk, where chances are just sending an email to their doctor and hoping that there was some better coordination was not going to make a difference. So they created a team within the hospital that provided some intensive follow-up kind of wraparound case management services to help that patient adhere to the treatment regimen to reduce the risk of a readmission. And that's one of those things where, again, in terms of targeting, they were able to use data to figure out who are the patients where we think that the risk is greatest, and therefore, since we can't afford to have this intensive wraparound team working with everyone, we're going to have them focus on the following patients. Okay? Now, in terms of what is the relevance to child protection, well, I love this quote. You don't have to agree with it, but this is Richard Gellis, who used to be the dean at UPenn, and he said, one might conceptualize child welfare agencies as social service agencies, but that would be incorrect. In reality, child welfare agencies are gatekeepers and the workers decision makers. So I think it is really important to keep in mind that we make an incredible number of really, really important decisions as child welfare workers. So a call comes into the hotline. We're not making that decision. Someone in the community is. But from there on out, notwithstanding the involvement of the courts, we're making a decision as to whether we screen that in for investigation or not. When a worker goes out, at least in California, they're making some really important decisions about whether we are substantiating the abuse or neglect or not. And then, of course, we're making a set of really important service decisions. Are we opening a case for ongoing services in the home? Do we think that the risk is so pronounced that we are going to place the child in foster care? Once a child is in foster care, when are we going to at least recommend to a judge that the child is reunified? And so we spend a lot of time talking about services and evidence-based services, but we don't actually talk that much about how we are triaging clients into different service paths and how important that is. So how do we, in a lot of jurisdictions, make decisions about, let's just think of the hotline, when a call comes into the hotline, okay? Now, we used to use, and in some jurisdictions we still use, what are called consensus-based assessment tools. I don't know that that's really the right term for it. And even though I put not great there, I think it's really important to keep in mind that different tools serve different purposes. So consensus-based tools are not great at predicting future risk, but consensus-based tools are generally tools where they're not intended to predict future risk. They're really intended to help standardize some of the thinking around what risk factors should I as a clinician be looking for or looking at in this house, because the consensus and the research and the theory would suggest that things around kind of substance abuse, I mean, who knows, but those might be associated with an elevated risk, so I need to kind of feature that into my thinking. Around maybe 10 to 15 years ago, a lot of jurisdictions moved to what are called actuarial risk assessment tools. So the most common one is called SDM, or structured decision making. It's what we use in almost all counties in California. And an actuarial risk tool is basically kind of an evolution of the consensus-based tool, in that it's using some of the research in terms of what do we think the risk factors are, but it's trying to develop a statistical model that would assign weights to different boxes you might check. Domestic violence is present, mom is young, you know, we've got a criminal justice history, so that then the tool can be used to say this child is at low, medium, or high risk of future abuse or neglect. The problem is, at least in California and New York, where I've kind of met with different workers, most workers are making decisions about risk and making decisions about what services to provide, and then they're filling out this paper and pencil tool because it's a part of what they're required to do. So it's not really being used to kind of figure out what to do. It's just one more thing that needs to be documented. It takes a lot of time, and it's pretty expensive to train and implement. And on the few occasions where there have been external validations of it, and even in the cases where they do internal validations, it actually doesn't have very good predictive validity or reliability. So it's just not, we're asking workers to do a lot, and it's not clear that it's a great tool. Now, predictive risk modeling, I think we have to put a big question mark there because it's new enough that we're still figuring out what can we do with predictive risk modeling. But with predictive risk modeling, the idea would be that it is that next evolution of actuarial tools, in the sense that rather than have a worker filling out a paper and pencil tool, we would just be harvesting data and generating a risk score. It might be data just from the child welfare system, which is probably where we would need to start in California, because we don't have integrated data across healthcare and criminal justice and whatnot. I'm working on a project right now in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, where they have a data warehouse where all of that data is in one place. But as a worker, what they've told us is the workers are not able to, even though they could look up, does this family have a criminal justice history? For the most part, they don't. Because it's really hard to access, and even if they see that a family has a criminal justice history, it might be useful to then making sure they ask the family about that, but they don't really know whether the criminal justice history should be treated as something that increases the risk or not. So that's a case, though, where they do have the data in a single warehouse, and so any prediction efforts that they would roll out would use data from a bunch of different sources. Okay, so predictive risk modeling, I want you guys to look at the red line there. Clinical judgment can never be replaced, but can it be improved? So I think that's one thing that a lot of people misunderstand. These prediction models are never going to be perfect, and I also don't think that they ultimately are better than clinical judgment in a lot of cases. But you have to remember, when we looked at all those decision points, we're making a lot of important decisions without all of the information at hand, and with potentially, I mean, in California, we have roughly 500,000 children who are reported to our hotline every year, right? So the question is, particularly when you have, if you think about a funnel of kids, in some of those really upstream decision points, the question is, how can we use data where it doesn't replace clinical judgment, but let's imagine that I'm a hotline worker, and what that reporter, who might be a neighbor who's not very skilled in conveying information that would be relevant to my assessment of whether abuse or neglect occurred, I've got a neighbor calling in. Based on what they've told me, it's probably a report I'm going to screen out. But there's been this statistical model that's harvested data and says that this is a really high-risk kid because of past reports, because of other things that have happened. So that might be a case where I say, you know what, I'm going to take this to my supervisor because I'm thinking we screen this out, but I've got a really high-risk score. Or, as they might do in Allegheny County, what they're talking about doing is, if there's a lot of really, really serious information that's conveyed, of course they're going to go out and investigate. But if it looks, the worker's thinking it might be low risk, but there's a high risk score attached, what they're going to do is they're going to not screen it in for investigation, but they're going to do a field assessment. So they at least have eyes on the child, and they're going to meet with the family. So that would be another approach. So again, it's not replacing clinical judgment. It can be a check on clinical judgment. It's another data point that can help us to hopefully make better decisions. So what are the applications of it? You can think about it from a primary prevention standpoint. So I've been talking with you a lot about some of these birth record data. What we've shown is that in California, if we were to run a predictive risk model for every child who was born in our state, we could do a pretty good job of figuring out which of those children are the most likely to be reported for abuse or neglect during the first 5 years of life. So what might we do with that information? Well, we want to be really careful because we don't want there to be stigma, and we need to make sure that we're not moving into some kind of minority report setting where we are basically thinking that someone will do something which they might not do and they certainly haven't done yet. But we might use it, again, in that home visiting context to say, you know what, these are families where we're going to offer them services. They don't have to take them, but they will have the right of first refusal on some of our most expensive and intensive services that we can't offer to everyone. So we could use it to prioritize children for early intervention and maltreatment prevention services. We could also think about using it in kind of a secondary prevention standpoint, where we would use it perhaps to hopefully improve some of our decisions at the hotline. And finally, in terms of tertiary prevention, in healthcare, we're talking a lot about precision medicine. We know that one size does not fit all, and frankly, not all clients need the same thing. But we're just beginning to think about how we can use data to make a better match. And so the question is, how could we use some historical data to figure out which clients are going to benefit the most from which different types of interventions and services that we might want to offer to minimize the negative consequences of abuse or neglect, okay? So, important to keep in mind. Okay, you guys have to laugh now. Thank you. Although I am obviously not the source of that quote, but prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future. And so I just want to give you an example. There are a bunch of jurisdictions that are kind of exploring this. So Los Angeles County is exploring it, New York City is exploring it, Connecticut, Allegheny. But the place where this kind of popped up initially was actually in New Zealand. And so that's the case study I'm going to provide. This was a project where I kind of got a call, and they're like, so we've got this project and we'd love for you to help. And I'm like, predictive what, right? So I swear I really had never even heard the term. So it's kind of been a crash course for me, but a really, really interesting one. So a case study from the other side of the world. So one of the things that they discovered in New Zealand is that 83% of their children who were substantiated as victims of abuse or neglect by age 5, when they looked back, they found them in their benefit system. They had an open benefit case between birth and age 2, okay? And so they said, well, wait a second. If all these kids are getting substantiated and we've seen them in another system earlier, is there a way that we could provide better or different services through that public benefit system to prevent abuse or neglect, but chances are it's going to be too expensive if we serve everyone at that higher, more intense level in the public benefit system. So can we figure out which kids are the most likely to be victims? Now, I have to tell you, the minute I came into that project, I was like, ooh, that leaves me a little bit uncomfortable. And it left me a little bit uncomfortable because what were we talking about doing? We were talking about screening and developing a model about abuse and neglect for just poor people who were in the public benefit system. And so even though, yes, we saw that 83% of the kids who were ending up as victims of abuse or neglect in their child protection system were in this public benefit system, it also felt like, oh God, and now we're gonna have this special screening tool for just those families. So there was prototype 1, which was based on the public benefit data, and then a bunch of other people I think were concerned about what the implications of that were. And so prototype 2 in New Zealand is one that is based on the full birth registry. So it's a universe, it would, if rolled out, and it probably won't be, but if it had been rolled out, it would be a universal screen to then figure out who gets offered services, okay? So, what does one do when developing a prediction model? So in New Zealand, they had the equivalent of what I talked about in Allegheny County, where they had linked records across different systems. So they were able to pull out predictor variables about the mother, about the child. They had great historical data that went all the way back to mom's full child protection history. Because this was public benefit data, they could see whether there was a partner in the house, regardless of whether they were married, kind of the in and out patterns of male caregivers. They could look at criminal justice history, so they had a lot of data. And so what you do is you throw it all in there. You take the kitchen sink approach and you throw in all of these variables. And so I want to point out that prediction modeling really is different than a lot of the research modeling you guys have probably talked about or read about in some of your courses. Because what researchers are often looking to do is to use individual variables to explain a phenomenon. And so there are a core set of assumptions that have to go into the relationship of different variables and the approaches to modeling. And presumably you also are looking for some type of causal relationship. Whereas with prediction modeling, the way that you assess whether you have a good model is how accurately does it classify individuals or some other phenomenon based on an outcome. And in some ways, everything you throw in is interacting. You're kind of setting up lots of interactions between all those variables, but you're not looking at the individual relationship between any variable and the kind of the class that you fall in. You're looking at it all together. So we started with these 224 predictors. We used a bunch of different methodologies, including, for those of you who've heard, machine learning algorithms. So there are lots of fancy methods. What we found is that basically a simple probit or logit model worked just fine for these data. And then the other thing that you have to do with predictive risk modeling is if you are developing a model on your data, what can happen is you might overfit your model. And a model is really only useful if it works on data which it wasn't developed with, and also if the model that you develop now works with clients who are being reported 6 months from now, a year from now. So what you're doing is you're developing a model on part of your data, and then you're testing how well does this model classify individuals on the other half of the data where I already know the outcome I'm looking at, and I want to see whether it flagged the right kids, okay? And so what they did is they developed a model where it was based on around 58,000 unique kids, and for each of those kids, when their public benefit case started, a risk score was generated from 1 to 10. So this is what it looked like. And what you can see is that for a child in that highest risk decile, decile 10, we saw that 48% of those kids went on to be substantiated victims of abuse or neglect. And you can contrast that with kids where the model put them in risk decile 1. The lowest 10% of kids, where only 2% of those kids went on to be victims of abuse or neglect. And you see kind of this linear relationship here, okay? So half, 2% in decile 1. And then we also, because this was still the modeling work we were doing based on the public benefit data, we also wanted to look at, well, what is the risk for kids who were never on the benefit? And you can see that the risk for those kids who really were not a part of this effort was even less than those in the lowest decile, so it was only 1.4%, okay? So other things to think about would be how many kids who end up as substantiated victims of abuse or neglect get captured by your model, okay? And so what we found is that if we were to target the top 20% of kids when the public benefit started, we would capture around 40 to 50% of kids who later ended up being substantiated victims. So some of what you're doing is it's more of a normative policy program, how much do things cost question when you figure out what threshold to set for whether you are including that group of kids to target them for services or not. So to give you an example, if we were instead, let's imagine we were talking about a program where we were just going to have something dropped in the mail. We wouldn't need this. We would probably just send something in the mail to everybody. If we had a program where maybe it required a nurse stopping by the bed of the mother who'd just given birth just to touch base with her, maybe we can't afford to roll that out for everybody, but we're going to say we can afford to do it for everyone in deciles 6 through 10. If we have a super expensive, high-intensity home visiting program, maybe we really don't have the availability of funds to serve everyone, so then we might say, you know what, we're just going to do the top 10%. So a lot of this is not that there's a number and it tells you what to do, it's that you can start to better stratify clients by risk, and you can figure out, given what I'm looking to do with this service intervention, who does it make sense to serve? Okay? Another really important thing to keep in mind is there time to intervene? So let's imagine that the model we had developed was really good at figuring out who is likely to be substantiated for abuse or neglect, but all of those kids got reported and substantiated 3 days later. Okay, we've got an accurate model, but it doesn't really mean anything because we don't have time to go out there and do something that would prevent the conditions that lead to abuse and neglect or child welfare involvement. The good news is that what we found here is that the majority of the maltreatment substantiations actually occurred more than 2 years after the kids hit that top kind of 2 deciles of risk. So we were showing that there is ample opportunity, or there was ample opportunity, where if something had been different and we had an intervention that worked, which is also another question, in theory we could have made a difference. Now, I want to just highlight one other thing. So this was kind of, I think the reason I was pulled into this project initially is I had published a paper where I had done what I will call a parallel thought exercise in California, where I had done some really, really crude back-of-the-envelope type calculations, where I'd been looking at risk factors at birth that were tied to the likelihood a child was reported for abuse or neglect in our state. And I said, you know, what if I just counted up how many risk factors were present? What would I see in terms of the likelihood the child is going to be reported? And so I looked at a few risk factors. I looked at, was it a young mom? And I was really simple about it. I said, yes, no. Young mom under the age of 24. Low birth weight, yes, no. 3 or more children, yes, no. No paternity, yes, no. Late prenatal care, high school degree, you get it. And then what I did is I counted up how many yeses each child had, and I plotted the predicted probability that the child would be reported for abuse or neglect. And so what you see is a really kind of nice linear relationship. You also see that having 1 risk factor, 2 risk factors, just being in poverty or just being a young mom does not significantly elevate the risk of being reported. There almost is this kind of accumulation of risk, or thought of differently, an increased deprivation of resources, whether they're social, material, or human, that probably leads to compromised parenting, or at least vulnerable families where the child welfare system becomes involved. But here's the thing. When I show this to people, a lot of times I'll have people like, wait a second, so this is so cool. Let's just serve everybody who has 7 or more risk factors, and we know that almost 90%, or I think it's like 85% of those kids are going to get reported. That'll be awesome. We'll totally fix everything. The problem is, in California, it's less than 1% of kids who have 7 or more risk factors. And that's why this was just a back of the envelope calculation. You want to do predictive risk modeling where you're thinking about how many kids you are capturing in a given group and what the risk is. Because yeah, we could go serve the kids who have 7 or more risk factors. It's going to be a very small number of kids, and we're not going to be successful at moving the needle because it's not a large enough share of the kids who have these risk factors and end up getting substantiated. So I just want to, again, use this as another example of how you're kind of thinking about those two, in some ways, competing aspects of predictive risk modeling, which is how specific is my prediction and how broad is the population of people who have those risk factors that I'm capturing in my model. Now, this is another thing where I have to tell you it's a lot, so I'll read some of it to you, so don't worry about this right now. But I become very excited about the upstream prevention model. I think there are great applications. I think most jurisdictions probably will begin moving to the use of statistical modeling at a hotline tool because it's pretty cheap to do. It doesn't have to replace anything else. You could still use other tools. It might just be a nice little additional check. But upstream prevention, I have faced a lot of, I almost want to say, hostile audiences, and you guys don't seem hostile yet, but if you are hostile, it's okay. Where I get that this is a little bit controversial. I get that we have to really consider stigma. We have to be very, very careful about whether it might potentially contribute to greater racial, ethnic disparities in some of our systems. I get that we have to be really careful in thinking about what our models are using, what kind of data they're pulling from. But what I hadn't appreciated is that actually most audiences don't really seem concerned about any of that. What I have found is that a lot of public health audiences in particular are very, very uncomfortable with this for a different reason. So I'm going to give you an example from New York City. A good friend who used to work at the Administration for Children's Services, not a good friend if you're watching this, Gilbert Taylor, but someone I like, moved over to homeless services. I'm like, okay, wait, I don't know where this will be presented, but I love him. I think he's great. And he moved over there, and because he was coming from child protection, he made the decision. There had been a series of deaths involving children who are with their families in the homeless shelter system in New York City. And so as a result of that, he initiated a new program where he was going to spend $2 million to hire 33 licensed social workers for a team that would be embedded within this homeless services shelter. And when families with kids came into the shelter, there would be kind of a risk assessment process where they would figure out which children and families were the most vulnerable, and they would be flagged and placed in Tier 2 shelters, which had more on-site services. So this reporter from the New York Times calls me up and is like, so what do you think about this? And I'm like, this is totally great. I love it. It's a new investment in prevention. It's trying to not only prevent deaths, but also prevent perhaps the need for the child protection system to come in a coercive fashion. And it's recognizing that we can perhaps screen families and figure out who may need some of these more intensive services. But they did not choose to use my quote. They chose to use the quote of another person where, even though I fundamentally disagree with her, I think that what she is summarizing here is a concern that a lot of people have. So she said, no list can predict 100%. Okay, so a fundamental problem with the city's focus on high-risk families, she said, is that even drawing on commonly recognized risk factors, no list can predict 100%. She pointed out some families can have none of the risk factors and still abuse their children, while others can have all of them and not hurt their families because they may have supportive family members or other resources. So I agree completely, but that's an empirical question as to whether we still have a tool that would help us to figure out which families families are more or less risky? And if we don't have spots in the Tier 2 shelter for everyone, don't we have an ethical and a fiscal responsibility to ensure that those families who most need those services get them? But this is the second part. She also said, we prefer not to look at child abuse from the medical model of finding a sick person and treating them. We prefer the inoculation model of preparing families and communities to raise safe and healthy kids. So what I keep hearing is that people feel as if any attempt to use predictive risk modeling or to target families may be undercutting efforts to move in a direction of more universal supports. And the response to this was, we should be offering the Tier 2 shelter option to all families. It came up in another conversation where it was about subsidized childcare and who should be prioritized for our limited subsidized childcare slots in LA County. And I had someone stand up in the audience and basically say, no, I don't agree with any of this because we should have subsidized childcare slots for every family who wants them. And I'm like, okay, we can agree on that, but we don't. And so I tend to be very pragmatic about the fact that, again, if we don't have the slots, we should be focusing our efforts. Now, I also think that often the debate is cast in kind of either or terms as opposed to both and terms. So of course I think that we should have broader methods of providing supports to families and building out community partnerships, but it doesn't mean that everyone needs the same thing. And I will tell you that colleagues from New Zealand, if they were here today, would say, oh, by the way, Americans, we have universal home visiting, we have universal midwives, and you know what? We still have abuse and neglect rates that look very similar to what you have here in the US. And we've realized that we need to do more for some of our families because universal, if someone is not willing to engage, or universal is just not enough for everyone. So I just wanted to bring that up because it's been, again, I'm all concerned about the racial aspects, the stigma aspect, but this seems to be what most people are concerned with. Yeah.
So this is really interesting because we see this in other areas too. So as most of you know, I'm not a social welfare person, as I told those of you who were at Ellen's house at dinner. So I do help. And it's the same thing when we're talking about, so I'm a firm believer, poverty is one of the biggest causes of poor health, right? So in this case, we can say, well, we just have to alleviate poverty. Let's not try to figure out how to help people who are currently in poverty prevent further health problems. And so I always feel in a bind as a social worker because I say, yeah, we have to try to prevent poverty. We need to do that. But in the meantime, we have people currently at risk, people who are currently in poverty who we can help so that they don't have poor health, et cetera. So it's the same thing here, right? People worrying that if we only focus on people at risk, that we're going to forget to deal with prevention. So as social workers, I think we deal with this a lot, and as social workers, we have to think about each of these levels. But it's a both and, I think, as you're saying, not an either or.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll mention is that, again, this is a new program that's being rolled out. So rather than be negative about the fact that there's a new $2 million investment in 33 licensed clinical social workers who are going to be on site, I would say, why don't we collect really good data, be really careful to make sure that it's implemented well, because then we'll have an even stronger argument for going back and saying, you know, what if we double the size of this so we can reach twice as many families and we can lower the threshold for what it takes to be defined as high risk, which is also, I think, kind of that iterative, how do we develop the evidence and use it as a stronger basis for arguing for a more enhanced set of services. Yeah.
I just want to say that with any kind of social service, money's an issue.
Yep.
Just, as much as you want to help everyone, you can't because you need money. And there has to be some kind of way to prioritize. And I think there's difference of opinion in how to do that. But there has to be some way that you prioritize who to help first, because that's because we simply don't have funding to help everyone.
I agree completely. No, I mean, I really do. But I think that there are certain groups where they feel like any acknowledgement of we're going to start, I mean, again, when I spoke to the reporter and she told me what this other woman had said, she said that kind of off the record, She was concerned that the Department of Homeless Services in New York City would use this as a way of saying, well, we're already helping risky families, and so we don't need to invest any more. And that they would, you see what I'm saying? Like it was, in some ways, it's political. It becomes a little bit political because even though I think most people in private would acknowledge what is the very pragmatic perspective, which is that we have limited resources and we need to serve those, we have to make a decision of who gets served first. From an out-facing public perspective, you've got people who are going to think that someone like Homeless Services is getting off the hook if they have this program for a certain set of clients, not everybody. So, okay. So I want to just conclude with, I've got 2 slides left, and then we can just open it up for any questions you guys may have. So I want to say that the outcome or event being modeled really, really matters in any prediction model. And so the way that we can think about it is that, let's imagine we're taking everybody who's born and we're trying to figure out who are the families who are most at risk of later child welfare involvement because we're going to prioritize them for early intervention services. You might describe it as, without having good tools or good data, it's kind of like finding a needle in a haystack, and it's going to be hard to do. But if you've got this massively great magnet, it becomes a lot easier. But one of the things to keep in mind is that when I've done some modeling work, if I try to model who's going to be reported out of the whole birth cohort, I could get a pretty good model because most of the kids and families are not really high risk. And so it's really just a matter of figuring out who has that accumulation of risk, and then we find them. When we're talking about trying to use tools like this further downstream, where the concentration of risks is already higher, it becomes a little bit less needle in a haystack with a big magnet versus needle in a pile of paper clips with a big magnet. It's just a harder thing to do, okay? So I actually do still think that there is enough of a range of risk among kids reported at the hotline that we'd be more in the haystack analogy. I have a lot of jurisdictions where they're like super excited about figuring out which kids which kids who are teens in foster care are going to be the most likely to emancipate out because maybe they would provide some more intensive services. And I think it's a great question, and it's one I'm really excited about looking at. But I often have to caution them that we may not have enough rich information in our available administrative data to differentiate risk of emancipation for that group of kids where they're already very high risk by the fact that they are teens and in foster care. And so I think that becomes, from a methodological standpoint, a harder task to be able to develop those models. So I just wanted to kind of say that. There are lots and lots of challenges which I have barely touched upon. One of the things that I've really enjoyed is, as a part of the project I worked on in New Zealand, a part of the project I'm working on in New Zealand, a part of the project we'll be rolling out in California, we have commissioned external ethical reviews where we've said we're going to pick the people in the field we think are going to like this the least and bring them to the table so they can tell us all of the concerns they have, because we don't want to be doing this in a vacuum, and we really want to make sure that we're thinking about that. And at some point, sometimes as a researcher you become so close to the work that frankly your independence and your perspective is a bit compromised. We have also, in all of those projects, brought together a group of researchers to come in and do an independent analysis of the data with a framework around racial disparities and how the models potentially contribute to racial disparities, but may also help reduce them if we think that it's not as if our current decision making is free of bias. There are obviously legal considerations. How can you use data from different systems, and can you use it in this kind of triaging modeling approach? It's really important to remember that we could have perfect models that tell us exactly which clients are high risk, but if we don't yet have services that would help to reduce those risks, then our models are probably not of any use. So it really does come down to not just the accuracy model, but the impactability of the condition we are trying to address or the outcome we're trying to prevent. And implementation is obviously going to be huge. We can, again, come up with a great model, but if people don't want to use it or people don't believe in it or people aren't bought in, then it's just another academic exercise. So I think these are some of the really interesting challenges that will face us in the next few years as we explore this. And it's not just child welfare that's exploring this. Criminal justice, for example, is using some of these tools to figure out who gets out on a pre-sentencing, at a pre-sentencing bail hearing. Homeless Services is trying to use this to figure out who gets put into their more intensive shelters with adult populations. Obviously, the healthcare system is using it. And so, child welfare is just another system exploring this. And then I do want to this is my final slide, but it is a quote that I love. It's a colleague who's actually a child welfare director in San Mateo County, which is a Northern California county, where he wrote a thought piece in the American Journal of Public Health. And this is what he said. If there's a 50-50 chance that a newborn could get a communicable disease in the first 5 years of life based on known risk factors, public health professionals would jump at the chance of finding that newborn. They would not institute a generic public health prevention campaign at the community level in the hopes that the newborn's family might see that campaign. Public health professionals would use information on an individual newborn to customize a prevention program for that newborn and their family. So, again, whether it's at the hotline or it's more primary prevention, I do think that there is a lot of truth to that. I mean, if we knew that an infant was going to have some serious health condition, we'd be perfectly happy with the fact that that we only had a 50% prediction. But there are a lot of complexities when we're talking about proactively intervening to prevent outcomes that may not happen in the private domain of family life, and that is, of course, the challenge that you guys deal with on a daily basis. So that is all I have. Any questions or other things to talk about? I think we've got still around 10 minutes, so yeah.
So there are many times you unfortunately have to say, just the administrative data isn't there.
Mm-hmm.
Are you or any colleagues working on ways that workers in the field can better collect data, or hospitals can better collect data, or obviously hospitals are kind of in the forefront of data collection, but making that easier for the research to be there to create these preventative tools?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it's a problem that is solving itself in a lot of cases. In a few different ways. One, when I look back at some of the really old data, you had all these screwy entries because at the time the technology was not such that it would say, boop, beep, you can't enter that in the field, you can't enter numbers here, it needs to be a text field. So I think the systems themselves are being better designed to reduce the amount of noise in the system. As to, then the other question also comes up, should we be adding more fields? I strongly believe we should not be adding more fields. And a perfect example would be that in terms of our federal outcomes and accountability reporting for the child welfare system, people want to drop in everything from education to teen pregnancy. And my take is that we are already asking workers to do a ton of data entry. And you can add more fields in, but again, if it's not useful to the immediate case management of that client, it's going to be a messy field. And I also hate that our workers would be doing data entry as opposed to working with clients. So that's where I think if we care about the educational outcomes of clients, by all means, let's look at that, but let's pull in the authoritative source of that by pulling in educational records for those children and finding ways to, if it's a policy question, looking at it through linked data. If it's something that an administrator needs, let's figure out how we have data sharing protocols so the data comes in. Same thing with healthcare. So I think that there is this, in some ways it feels easier to just take the system we all know and add more columns to it, but I don't think that's what we should be doing. I think we should be thinking about data sharing.
So when you were talking about, I'm thinking back to the slide where you had the comparisons of children whose mothers had past CPS intervention and those who hadn't. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that slide and some of your presentation implicates intervention within CPS that clearly isn't working, or might not clearly, but it would implicate intervention that fails. Do you have any suggestions, or does your data lend to suggestions about what interventions work or don't work in terms of intervening?
So are you talking about this slide?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think that's a tricky one. So one, I will plead out and say that I'm not an intervention researcher. So I use a lot of these data but I don't necessarily know where the evidence lies in terms of interventions. But I'll give you an example from another analysis we did, which is not here, and I think it's a perfect example of what you're talking about. So one of the other studies we did, we looked at infants who'd been reported to the child protection system, but where they remained at home after that first report, okay? So we found in California about 82% of infants who get reported, we keep them at home after that first report. What we then did is we followed the kids who remained at home for 5 years to say, was this just a fluke occurrence that a report came in? And whatever related to that report, did we fix it so we don't see the family again? Or how many of these infants came back to the attention of the system? And what we found was that 60% of the infants got re-reported, but we also found that a case was opened for ongoing services through the child protection system in less than 10% of those families, okay? So we said, listen, we're kind of blind as to what services were offered, and we know that only a small percentage got services through the child protection system. It could be that a bunch of families got services elsewhere, and they were really great services, and if we'd known that they got services and we'd looked at their rates of re-reporting, it might have been 20%, but because we didn't have enough service slots, it looks high. But here's the other thing. We did find that the families who got services from the child protection system had the highest rate of re-reporting. It was 70%. And when I present that, a lot of people will be like, oh my God, that's terrible. That must mean that our services don't work at all. And I always have to caution them and say, listen, we know that the kids we substantiated and opened services for were probably our highest risk kids. The alternative may have been to put them in foster care immediately. We also know that there was probably more surveillance there, because if we were successful in connecting them to services, they're going to have more contact. But it's also important to remember that we don't have a counterfactual. We don't know what their rate of re-reporting would have been absent whatever services we offered. So if I told you that absent opening the case and providing services, 100% of those infants would have been re-reported, the fact that it was only 70% actually looks somewhat successful. So I think that's my long-winded way of saying it's very, very complex. I have to admit, I don't have great service data, and interventions are not my area of expertise, but I don't think that any of the data I have actually suggest that we don't have things that are working, even though certainly the numbers would suggest that we hope or would hope that things were better than they are. I think I saw another hand. Yep. Yeah.
How irresponsible do you think it would be, despite all of the ethical quandaries, for just a second, let's set those aside, to develop specific programs or agencies and services around these predictive risk factors? So it's like the New York City case, let's say we make more homeless shelters for families, but has it been determined for sure that families put into those tier 2 buildings are receiving the best services around the potential risk factors? I feel like I'm kind of confusing myself.
No, I think I understand what you're saying. So I'll try to answer it and tell me if I'm getting to it. So one, I think we do have to be really careful that a lot of the things I am calling risk factors we shouldn't assume are causal. So paternity is a perfect example, right? As I said, that's going to be a proxy for a few conditions. We don't know which of those is actually contributing to the increased risk. And to be very clear, if we suddenly got a bunch more dads to put their names on the birth record at birth, that's probably not going to necessarily change things, right? So I think we have to be careful about the risk factors specifically, and we have to recognize that in a lot of cases, if we had different data, if we had, for example, substance abuse or domestic violence data, we might see that some of what we are now identifying as a risk factor drops out of the model completely because it was always just a surrogate marker of some other dynamic. Now, as to your question around building out services, I don't think we'd want to build out services that focus on the risk factors that are identified in these models. I do think we'd want to build out services around the people these models identify. That I do think I feel comfortable with. A great example, though, in terms of how this would need to be prediction at one very high level and then much more rich clinical information gathering at another, is that, again, we can figure out who these families are, but each might be very unique in what their service needs are, and that requires different data. As to, again, building out the services, one of the things I think has really hindered our field when we talk specifically about maltreatment prevention is that we have not been, frankly, as researchers and maybe as practitioners as well, as thoughtful as we should be about who we get in the door for services. And so to give you an example, we could have a randomized trial of some home visiting program, but if everybody we pull into that home visiting program was only a little bit risky, so let's imagine we have this kind of distribution, this bell curve of risk for families, most of the families we see in the child protection system are kind of out at the tail. I mean, these are super risky families. They're super, lots more challenges in terms of engagement, et cetera. I think a lot of our services in terms of dosage and even the services we evaluate tend to target families that are just a little bit risky. They're almost those families where if you think about that graph I showed you, they're the families that maybe have 1 or 2 risk factors as opposed to the 4 or 5. And so if we're designing services around those families, it might work for those families, it might not work for our families, but it also means that when we evaluate those programs and we say, were we successful at preventing abuse or neglect such that we can justify investing more and more here, we often find that maybe we improved some developmental outcomes for kids, but we don't find that it had an effect on abuse or neglect. And I think one of the reasons for that is that all of these studies have really been underpowered to detect that difference because too many of the families were kind of just a little bit risky as opposed to the really high risk families. So I actually like the idea that we would be building out services around these higher risk families, figuring out what it takes to engage them, and then really being rigorous in thinking about whether we are able to impact some of those downstream outcomes. I don't know if that was quite your question, but okay, cool.
Absolutely, thank you.
Can I add one thing to that? I think one thing that's interesting is that that's been in my theory class, we talk about a difference between a model that can predict things and a model that predicts change. They're totally different from each other. So the things that predict people being in this risky category, like you said, are not the variables that you look at to predict how to improve change. And so while the predictive model can be atheoretical, we can throw in all this information so that we can target who's most at risk. We need to use our theories about what's going to work with change when we develop the models to intervene with people. So that's where it's not just about targeting people anymore. It's about having ideas about what's actually going to work to create change among people who already have this risk.
Yep, exactly.
All right.
Yes.
I noticed in your risk factors that you didn't mention domestic violence or drug use at all, so I'm wondering if you looked at that at all, because as part of my internship, I'm going through all the referrals for La Crosse County, and those are a couple of them that I'm seeing the most with the reports that come in are drug use and domestic violence. I'm just wondering if...
Great question. So a lot of the work I presented today was based on data we could pull from the birth records. So we were, when I look at, say, low birth weight, I'm assuming that's a proxy for a few different things, including potentially prenatal substance exposure, but we don't have great data. The other real limitation of the birth record data is it's static, right? So it's a snapshot of what we could measure at one point in time. A lot of those things we are measuring actually can change over time. But what we are doing is we are doing some work with the structured decision-making data that we have in California. Somehow or other, we've never once looked at it. But the structured decision-making data is the tool that's used at the hotline right now. And we were actually able to find completed SDM tools for 96% of the referrals that came in. And where that is very useful is that it provides much more of a census of was domestic violence present, substance abuse. So all of these richer risk factors that would underlie, say, an allegation of neglect, where right now we're just kind of stuck with that broad category. So we're going to begin exploring some of that data, keeping in mind that, yes, that data has limitations too, because it's partly what the reporter was telling the hotline worker they saw, and then when a worker went out, what they chose to record about what they saw. But I think that those are certainly two of the risk factors that are probably going to be most salient, and where we're trying to find some other data sources that would allow us to look at those.
I'm just curious, you said that the data that you found might contribute to racial bias and just, disparity, and I'm just curious if there's ways that you're looking at to control how it's contributing to that, like social conditions or surveillance bias.
Yeah, no, it's a really tricky situation, and one where I don't think we have a good solution right now. With the California data, one of the things that we found was that race ethnicity was a really strong predictor of child welfare involvement, substantiation, et cetera, until we put in all those other control variables, and then actually race ethnicity dropped out as a statistically significant predictor completely. In different jurisdictions, we find slightly different things though, and in the case of predictive risk modeling, there are a different set of concerns. So for example, in the work we're doing in Allegheny County, if we think that these other systems are somewhat biased in terms of how they interact with different groups, then having a criminal justice record, if you're an African American father, should be weighted differently than if you have a criminal justice record and you are a white father, because we know that there are lots of reasons that there would be more different meaning there. So in Allegheny County, what we've been wrestling with is we don't really want to exclude race from our models, because in fact what we want to do is have lots of interactions for race, ethnicity, and the data source that a record is coming from to account for some of what we think will be bias in the way that those systems operate. But there have also been stakeholders where they say, no, you know what, we would like to have a completely separate model for black families and white families, which feels a little uncomfortable. I mean, so we don't have a great solution. I think that the right direction from a kind of a methodological perspective and an ethical perspective is probably to include race with those interactions for where the data sources are coming from. But one of the other interesting things we've done is we've looked at, it's probably too complicated to talk about right now, but we have been able to do something called a regression discontinuity analysis, where it allows us to kind of get a sense of, is the system right now operating in a biased fashion with how it responds to reports coming in concerning black children versus white children. And we actually found that it is. Okay, it's not huge, but there's definitely evidence that we are treating some of those reports differently. And so it's also important to keep in mind that some of this work may actually provide a bit of a corrective function. And so I think the key thing is just that there's lots of eyes on the work and lots of different perspectives at the table, thinking through what the implications are and how we monitor this on an ongoing basis. Okay.
So we are out of time. So I wanted to say thank you very much for your time.
Thank you guys. Thanks for all the great questions.